Okay, welcome back, everybody. First things first, we are going to be moving on from China, at least for now. Um, if we had still had regular class, there was a few more things I would have liked to have covered, a few more activities that I originally had planned. Unfortunately, given circumstances and how pressed for time we are, we need to move on. So today and Friday, we are going to wrap up Unit 8 by talking about the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. Um, there isn't really a chapter in the book for this. I think there's like three-quarters of a page in one of the sections that talks about it. So I'm going to cover pretty much everything you need to know about it in this PowerPoint. If you have any additional questions about it or there's anything that's not clear, you can certainly shoot me an email or even just ask a question on the stream if you don't mind it being public for everybody to see. As always, there are no dumb questions, especially in history. So, the reason why the breakup of the Ottoman Empire is such an important topic is because it really set the stage for everything that's going on today in the Middle East. It's certainly not the only reason for all the conflicts there. That goes back literally over 1,000 years to the founding of Islam and even before that. But the modern issues in the Middle East, a lot of them stem from what happened in the aftermath of the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. So again, that's why this is such an important topic for us to cover, and why I really feel like we need to move on and spend a day talking or two talking about this. So, the first thing you need to know is that the empire had really been in decline for quite some time. Now, internally, that decline had begun with the death of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent all the way back in 1566. Suleiman was the longest reigning of the Ottoman sultans, certainly one of the most capable, had ruled over the empire at its height during what is still today really regarded as its golden age. His eldest son and most capable heir, Mustafa, had been executed on his orders as a result of various palace plots and intrigues. And as a result, Suleiman was followed on the throne by another of his sons, Selim, who proved to be a completely incompetent drunkard and was really just the first in a series of increasingly incompetent sultans, many of whom were overthrown and then murdered and replaced by various relatives. Even those sultans who proved to be stronger and more capable were often overthrown by one of the various factions that was vying for power and who didn't want to see a strong sultan on the throne. Nevertheless, despite this series of weak sultans, they were able to maintain the empire's territorial integrity and even add to it a little bit until 1683 and the start of what's known as the Great Turkish War. That was the Ottomans' last attempt to really push into Central Europe. They lay siege or attempted to lay siege to Vienna once again, and were ultimately completely defeated in that war. And for the first time in their history, had to give up large chunks of their territory in the subsequent treaty that was signed in 1699. And that really began the empire's long, very slow decline, again, both internally and territorially. Um, by the 19th century, the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire was often referred to, I should say, as the sick man of Europe, particularly amongst the other great powers of Europe. It really probably should have collapsed long before it actually did, but the other great powers were kind of propping it up, mainly because they were all afraid that if it completely collapsed, one of the other powers would seize huge chunks of their territory, particularly Austria and Russia. Russia had long wanted to seize Constantinople, Istanbul, whatever you want to call it, and Anatolia. They had long-standing claims to that region. Austria, as I'm sure many of you know, really wanted to push further into the Balkans, into Serbia, and all those formerly Ottoman-ruled territories. Again, the other great powers, particularly France and Britain, Italy, after Italy came into being, really didn't want to see that happen. usual just imperialism and colonial infighting. So they had propped it up for far longer than it probably should have been. The perfect example of that is the Crimean War from 1853 to 1856, when Britain and France actually allied with the Ottoman Empire to defeat Russia. That's pretty much the perfect example of, again, this kind of propping up of the otherwise collapsing empire. During that time, the empire was suffering from some severe economic decline while the rest of Europe was industrializing. The empire really didn't. It continued to maintain a agricultural economy, even more so than Russia, which we already learned was one of the slower nations in Europe to industrialize. As I already mentioned, there was a lot of factional infighting, a lot of replacing and overthrowing of the sultans and various other politicians. Um, this was also a large multi-ethnic empire. You had Turks, you had, originally before they lost it, Serbians, Arabs, Armenians, Egyptians, all kinds of different, I guess, ethnic groups. And that became a huge problem, keeping peace and control over such a large and multi-ethnic empire. This is what the empire looked like at the start of World War I. So in 1914, it's that purple region that you can see that consists of modern day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Kuwait, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel, and a little bit of modern day Saudi Arabia. If you compare that to the map from the previous slide, you can see just how far it had collapsed. Still, at least in terms of size and area, pretty large, formidable empire. But in reality, a lot of these regions were under their control in name only, particularly as you got down into Saudi Arabia and into what is now the Middle East. If there was an issue, if there was a revolt, they could send troops there. They were still recognized as being the rulers of this land. But in reality, it was often very difficult to exert constant control over those regions. Pretty much the further you got from Constantinople, the less central direct control they had. So now we come to entry into World War I itself, which was really the final nail in the coffin for the empire. This man right here was Sultan Mehmed V. He was the official ruler of the empire at the start of World War I. Again, I say the official ruler because in reality, the empire was ruled by these three men you can see below him. These three men were known as the Three Pashas, Pasha being an honorary title for a high-ranking political or military official. It was pretty much the highest title you could be given if you weren't a member of the royal family. The Three Pashas had come to power during or in the aftermath of what's known as the 1908 Young Turk Revolution. That revolution had replaced the long-standing absolute monarchy with a constitutional monarchy that in theory was supposed to be democratic. In reality, these three men dominated the government and ruled the empire. They were Talat Pasha, who was the Grand Vizier, aka the Prime Minister, and the Minister of the Interior, Enver Pasha, who was the Minister of War, and his name is here given as Kamal. You usually see it as Jamal Pasha, who was the Minister of the Navy. And again, together, these three men, known as the Three Pashas, really ruled the empire. Now, 3 months after the official start of World War I, the Ottomans had entered the war as allies of Germany and Austria-Hungary, and they did so primarily for protection against the Russians. Again, the Russians were really viewed as their greatest and most long-standing enemy, so even though they had had conflicts with Austria in the past, Russia was their more immediate concern, so they allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary as a member of the Central Powers. They were also hoping to gain back British-influenced Egypt. For a long time, Egypt had been a key part of the empire, but they had lost it in the last century or so, and it had fallen under pretty much British rule / British influence. It was a British sphere of influence, I guess you could call it. And the Ottomans were hoping through the war that they might be able to gain it back. Now, entry into the war, joining the war, turned out to be a huge mistake for the Ottomans, mainly because, as I mentioned before, they still had a very agriculture-based economy. They really lacked the industry, the modernity needed to fight such an industrialized war. They were totally unprepared to fight the type of war that it turned out to be. And again, that would really be their biggest mistake. They were totally unprepared. During the war itself, the Ottomans had to fight on four, maybe depending on how you look at it, five major fronts. And again, remember, this is an empire that was very unprepared to fight this war. We usually talk about what a big deal it was for Germany to have to fight on two fronts in both of the world wars. Well, the Ottomans had to fight on 4 or 5 different fronts in this war. We'll talk about two of them in more detail in just a minute, but just to run through them all real quickly. At the start of the war, the Ottomans invaded Egypt and tried to seize control of the Suez Canal. They were forced back, and the British then invaded what is now Israel up into Lebanon. The British also invaded Kuwait up into Mesopotamia, into what is now Iraq. There was the Gallipoli campaign, which is one of the ones we'll talk about in just a little bit. There was also the Arab Revolt down on the Arabian Peninsula, and that's another one we'll talk about in just a minute. And lastly, there was, as you can see up in the upper right corner in the dark green, the front against the Russians in the Caucasus region. Now, the reason why that front is of particular importance was because that region in dark green right there is historic Armenia. It is the historical homeland of the Armenian people. Now, the Armenians had long since kind of spread out and settled really throughout Anatolia, which is that, area that's modern day Turkey between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. So they had spread out throughout that. But when the Russians invaded their historic homeland, the Ottomans began to view the Armenians as a potential threat, particularly because the Armenians are historically Orthodox Christians like the Russians and not Muslims like most of the Ottoman subjects. So the Ottomans began to view the Armenians as a potential threat, even though most of these people were just peaceful settlers who lived in villages throughout Anatolia. And had really no interest in fighting a war and were no threat. The Ottomans viewed them as a threat, and as a result began to round them up, and that led to the Armenian genocide, which, because it's Genocide Awareness Month and because it's just such an important topic, we will look at in more detail on Friday. We're going to read some sources and really look at some of the horrific atrocities that occurred during that time period. So the first front that I want to talk about in more detail today was Gallipoli, which was that peninsula you can see marked there on the map on the northern side of the Dardanelles, which is the strait between the Aegean Sea and the Sea of Marmara. It's kind of the gateway, if you will, towards Constantinople/Istanbul. And the reason why this peninsula became important was because once the Western Front turned into a stalemate, once it developed into this trench warfare that we all know so much about, the British were looking for a way to quickly knock the Ottomans out of the war and relieve pressure on the Russians. They hoped to land at Gallipoli and then march on and take Constantinople and therefore knock the Ottomans out of the war. Now, this plan was originally drawn up, or at least partially drawn up, by Winston Churchill, actually. He was at the time in charge of the British Navy, and the plan originally called for a fleet of battleships to sail up the Dardanelles to support the land invasions and to attack Constantinople, but they found that the Ottomans had heavily mined the strait, and as a result, the fleet was actually forced to turn back. The land invasion, the actual invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula, did go ahead, though. On this other map, you can see the various, landing zones for the British forces. Now, you might see marked on that map, you might see the word Anzac. ANZAC is an acronym that stands for Australia and New Zealand Army Corps, basically British colonial troops from Australia and New Zealand. So the British land on this peninsula, on the tip of this peninsula, um, and it turns into a complete disaster for them. Very rough terrain. The Ottomans had actually really dug in and been prepared for their landings, and as a result, they never really advanced very far beyond the initial landing areas and suffer over 250,000 Allied casualties. Complete disaster for the British, actually costs Winston Churchill his job at the time because it's such a disaster. Um, Another important thing to come out of Gallipoli that we'll come back to in a little bit was on the Ottoman side, their most successful and prominent commander, really their hero on that side, was a man called Mustafa Kemal, a general called Mustafa Kemal, and he becomes very important again in a little bit. Second front that I want to talk about today is the Arab Revolt. The British sent several officials and military advisors into the Middle East to meet with the non-Turkish subjects of the empire there, primarily the Arabs, in an attempt to stir up revolts and dissent. They sent these advisors to several different groups. One such advisor was named, as weird as it sounds, Captain William Shakespeare, no relation to the famous author, and they sent Shakespeare to the Saudis to meet with Abdulaziz ibn Saud, the founder of modern Saudi Arabia, to secure support for their invasion of Mesopotamia, which you could see on that map that I showed earlier on the various fronts. Most famously, though, was Captain T.E. Lawrence, better known to history as Lawrence of Arabia. You may recall there was a famous movie made about him. He's quite a famous figure. And they sent him to meet with the Emir of Mecca and the various Arabian tribes along the Red Sea. And he helped them kind of organize and focus their resistance, led them in a series of hit and run attacks and otherwise, what you might call guerrilla warfare, and proved very, very successful at that, and actually started what's generally termed the Arab Revolt, and again proved very, very successful in disrupting the already kind of weak Ottoman rule in that region. Now, in return for all of these revolts, for all of these hit and run attacks, and for waging war against the Ottomans, the British agreed to support Arab independence after the war. Now, the problem with promising Arab independence was that the British were making other similar promises at the same time. One of those promises was the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which was actually a letter written by the British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild, the leader of Britain's Jewish community. And in that letter that you can see on the right there, Balfour promised that the British government would support a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Although modern Israel wouldn't officially be founded until after World War II, the letter did result in hundreds of thousands of Jewish people migrating to Palestine during the 1920s and 30s. Now, I do want to point out the letter does state that it is to be, and I quote, clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Despite that clear statement in this letter, this promise to the Jewish people still flew in the face of the earlier promise that the British had made to the Arabs, and as a result, this is often seen as the start or one of the beginnings of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that still continues to this day. While the British were making all of these promises to both the Arabs and the Jews, they were also making a secret agreement with the French, known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which the two countries agreed to divide up all of the Ottoman lands in the Middle East between themselves. And you can see a map of that plan here on the right. It included zones of direct control and influence for both countries. Again, this was a secret agreement regarding the exact same land that they were promising to these other groups. And the reason why Britain and France were so interested in the Middle East, beyond the usual imperialism and colonialism, was that navies were beginning to make the switch from coal power to oil as their source of fuel. And while I want to stress that oil had not yet been discovered in the Middle East in the quantities that we now know exist there, there had been some discovered in Persia and what is now Iran, and both countries were very interested in seeing if more existed in the Middle East. They were very interested to get in there and explore for that oil. This agreement also had the consent of both Russia and Italy, but again, it was a secret agreement not known to the wider world. When the war ended, the Allies did begin to divide up the Ottoman Empire according to this Sykes-Picot Agreement. And here we have a map of what Anatolia would have looked like according to the Treaty of Sèvres, which was the 1920 treaty partitioning the empire. As you can see, Britain and France both would have received the lands that they claimed according to the Sykes-Picot Agreement in the Middle East. Italy would have received that area with the green stripes down in the southwest. Russia, because they dropped out of the war, was no longer a part of the agreement and wouldn't have received anything. But the Armenians would get a homeland in that light blue up in the northeast. You can see that the Greeks also got some land in the west. They were not originally part of the agreement, but they had taken advantage of the end of the war and Ottoman helplessness to kind of jump in and grab some regions of Anatolia that had been culturally Greek, particularly in ancient times. Now, as you can see, according to this map, the empire wouldn't have been dissolved completely. It would have kind of been left as a kind of a rump state, if you will, with just that unstriped area of light yellow in the center around Ankara being really left. The rest would have been the striped areas, would have been nominally belonging to the empire, but really under the influence and control of one of the Allied powers. Despite the Ottomans' clear defeat in the war, the Turkish people were not willing to just sit by and do nothing while the victorious Allies carved up all of their land. The before mentioned hero of Gallipoli, Mustafa Kemal, organized what became known as the Turkish National Movement. And that's him, Mustafa Kemal, in the center of the picture there, sitting at the desk while he was leading the Turkish National Movement. And under his leadership, they did succeed in driving out the Greeks and most of the other foreign armies from Anatolia during what became known as the Turkish War of Independence, which lasted from 1919 to 1923. And then on November 1st, 1922, so right near the end of that War of Independence, the Turkish Parliament in Ankara, so this was the Turkish National Movement's parliament, abolished the Sultanate, officially abolished the Ottoman Empire, and proclaimed the Republic of Turkey. Mustafa Kemal became the first president of Turkey. That is him on the left. I think that was in 1934 that picture was taken. And he stayed in office as president of Turkey until his death in 1938. During his time in office, he managed to institute many reforms that basically transformed Turkey into a secular parliamentary republic. Those reforms included making public education both free and mandatory for everyone. He instituted a European legal system and did away with the Islamic-based Sharia law system that would have existed in the Islamic Ottoman Empire. He switched from the traditional Turkish alphabet to the Latin alphabet, although with some Turkish characteristics, as you can see if you've ever read some Turkish names. There's a few alterations, but for the most part, it's a Latin alphabet. And he did give women political rights, particularly the right to vote as well. And in 1934, the Turkish parliament bestowed upon Mustafa Kemal the honorary surname Ataturk, which means Father Turk, essentially calling him the father of the nation. And he is now most commonly referred to either just as Ataturk or as Kemal Ataturk. And in recent years, or at least until recent years, really until the last 15 or 20 years or so, Turkey was long the most secular, stable, and safe countries in the entire region, in the entire Middle East. Unfortunately, in recent years, particularly under the increasingly dictatorial rule of Recep Erdogan, um, Turkey is starting to slide back into more of an authoritarian regime. But for a long time, after the founding of the modern Republic of Turkey, it was a very successful state.